Okay, good evening all in the room and also the millions watching from their laptops at home. And welcome to tonight's Economy and Place Policy and Scrutiny Committee. I'm Councillor Callum Taylor and I'm the chair of the committee. And we'll go straight into the agenda. Firstly, as ever, any declarations of interests? No, silence is gold. And next is a look at the minutes from the previous two meetings that we've had on 17th of Jan and the 30th of Jan. Do any members have any? Councillor Dave Taylor.
Yeah, I just have a query, Chair, on page 5, the economic updates. The third bullet point says there's been investment into the city and that the executive member, the head of economy undertook to circulate the information to members following the meeting. Did we receive that? Because I don't remember receiving it. I don't believe so.
I don't think we have, Councillor Taylor.
Okay.
The officer from Dem Services has just told me she'll chase it up.
Fine.
Thanks for raising it. Any others? I do have one, a minor one, but just want to close the loop on an item. It was when we were discussing public realm, so it would have been from the minutes of the 17th of January. Councillor Cuthbertson, I think you said you'd get back to the public speaker on Guildhall toilet issue. Have you had any contact?
Not so far, but I have today got the contact details for the Guildhall management team. So I will be picking that up.
Smash
and
it.
I'm sure the public speaker of that evening will be listening tonight. So there we go.
Well, we have them down to speak. Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Cuthbertson. Okay, so no more comments on those minutes. Happy to see them as approved, which brings us to public participation. Sorry, Angela, I sort of covered both in that. We had no further comments on those, did we? No. Cheers, thank you. So yeah, public participation. We've got two registered speakers tonight. One remotely and one in person. The first speaker is Flick Williams, who I think is going to try and cover two agenda items in her 3 minutes. So Flick is speaking on the York Civic Trust 9 Cities report and the City Centre Café licenses report. Flick, can you hear us?
I can. Good evening.
Hello, Flick. You know the drill. I'm not going to be too over the top about the 3 minutes, but don't take too many liberties, yeah?
You'll be delighted to learn that I'm here today to commend and thank officers for their diligent enforcement of café licensing infractions. Many local disabled people have made it clear that getting around the city is now significantly easier than previously. I very much hope that the same level of vigilance and enforcement remains in place as we go forward into the warmer months, but it is still a shame that we got here via such a rough and rocky road. Given the number of disabled visitors to the city last summer who said a combination of the blue badge ban and cafe furniture obstructions meant they would not be returning, I do fear that the damage done by the previous licensing policy may not be so easily rectified from a tourism perspective. And of course, the other barriers to visiting, such as parking, lack of suitable seating, lack of accessible toilets, have not yet been rectified. I should be interested to know of the 29 breaches of conditions identified in the last 2 months, only 3 reported by me, I hasten to add, how many, if any, are on their second warning. I have no preference as to how businesses in breach are dealt with, only that footpaths remain unobstructed and facilitate egress of all pedestrians, including disabled people. And to that end, I should like to ask what enforcement is in place regarding A-boards. We have a long-standing council policy prohibiting their use across a wider geographical area of the city than just the foot streets, with different conditions applying in Micklegate. And yet yesterday I counted 18 of them in the foot streets alone, causing varying degrees of obstruction. Now, where they restrict access to a business's premises, I assume that the shop or cafe doesn't want my money or that of any other disabled person, but many are situated where they are hazardous to people who are blind, visually impaired, or have other cognitive impairment. Similarly, there are businesses who now have pot plants and other decorative items out on the street, also narrowing the width of the footpaths. I understand it, having watched the complete free-for-all created by the sudden onset of outdoor dining. Why wouldn't you think, I pay my business rates, surely that entitles me to a bit of pavement too? So there is still work to do to make the city as accessible and mobility friendly for pedestrians as possible. Let's lose the A-boards, the topiary and ornaments such as Heaven Help Us, an antique pram that has a metal mouse head. Finally, in relation to the Civic Trust report, as we embark upon the immense challenge of drawing up a local transport plan, I am fearful of the impact on disabled people's mobility. As we have already seen, promising exemptions for those who have no choice in the modal shift imperative is cold comfort. We have an exemption only until it is taken away. Thank you.
Thank you, Flick. And before you go, if I may, I'd just like to ask committee members if they have any questions for you. Do we? No, you must have covered everything, Flick. Thank you once again for your contribution.
Thank you.
Cheers. Our next speaker is Dave Merritt, who will be commenting on item 6, which is a highways report. Where's best for you? Can you take a seat at the bottom, Dave? Thank you. Sorry, I'm not used to this room. It's been a while. Once again, I'm not going to be too heavy with the 3 minutes, but let's not get too excitable.
I probably won't exercise the 3 minutes. I'm here as much to hear on the item, the earlier item on the Trust 9 cities. I wrote one of the papers for it and happy to expand if required.
Right.
On the highways maintenance, I just wanted to raise the issue of how some of the works are being prioritised, particularly works on the major radials and the inner ring road, because there are sections of it that are severely degraded. Particularly at some of the junctions where you've obviously got tendency of vehicles going around corners to rut them, and it breaks up the road surface. You get subsidence effects. And as a cyclist, and it's been raised with me by other cyclists, the state of some of those road surfaces is potentially quite dangerous in terms of risking cyclists' security and safety. So, for instance, the junction of St Leonard's Place and Museum Street, the section of Museum Street going down towards the end of Lendal, where the road is very heavily rutted and uneven, and it tends to push cyclists out into the middle. And sometimes you get cars trying to overtake you, and it's not a very satisfactory situation. Or if you go around Lendal Gyratory, if you come down to the bottom of Lendal Gyratory to go under the bottom arch, the whole of the road surface there is gravel. And given that you've got vehicles turning, there's a risk of skid. So, as I say, it does raise the question of how works are being prioritised, and they may not be major works, but they probably involve significant, temporary closure of little sections of the key road network in order to deal with them. And they don't seem to be figuring in the forward programme in the way that I'd expect to see, given how far they have gone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Any questions for David at the moment? Sorry.
It's not so much a question for Dave. I'm just suggesting, Chair, that when we get to item 6, perhaps the director would respond to Dave's concerns.
Yeah, thanks again, Dave. I should add, by the way, and I apologise for not doing this at the start, we do have apologies from Councillor Pete Kilbane, and Councillor Janet Lucker is kindly substituting for him this evening. Okay, so that's public participation done, which brings us to the first main report of the evening, which is from the York Civic Trust. So whoever is part of that presentation, please take a seat at the bottom. So we've got Tony Clark's. We have too many Tonys in the building. So we've got Professor Tony May and Andrew Morrison present for this item. Thank you both for coming tonight. I think when we usually take reports, we usually ask for a sort of broad intro summary, and then we'll go into questions if that suits you both. But
yes,
equally happy to play to your tune.
Well, thank you, Chair, very much for the invitation to speak and the opportunity just to look at what we were doing a couple of years ago on these case studies. Just a little bit of background. Back in January 2021, we were invited to offer some advice to the council in the development of its new local transport plan. At the time, the intention was to produce a consultation draft for December 2021, January 2022, and of course that slipped somewhat. What we did in the first 3 months was to review the 2011 local transport plan, produce a set of modal strategies on walking, on cycling, and so on. And at that stage, and in the discussions in April 2021, it was suggested that some case studies would be useful. And we offered to work up some drafts. And during that month, we agreed on the 9 cities that we would look at, 5 in the UK and 4 in continental Europe. And we produced those as drafts in the version that you got in your papers, late May, early June 2021. And we made it clear that these were drafts. They were exploring what was interesting in a particular city. They weren't designed to be full case studies. And we raised the possibility of having some workshops or even site visits to explore them further. And we also offered to work up perhaps 2 or 3. We didn't have the resources to do more than that. And that's about where things stuck. And we reiterated the question every so often, but none of these has ever been taken further. They do appear in brief references in the draft local transport strategy that came out last month. Certainly there's a brief summary for each of our 4 continental ones, and Oxford and Cambridge appear in the UK reference. But other than that, that's where they stand. And obviously it's a bit difficult to take them further now because they're 2 years old. And if we were to pick them up, they would need to be updated considerably. But what we did when we published our own transport strategy for York a year ago was to include a section which I produced as a PDF for you, that just reviewed those 9 case studies and what the key messages were from those. And I thought it might be helpful before we break for questions and discussion, just to summarize what the key strategic messages from those 9 were as far as we were concerned, if that's okay. So first of all 9 had a clear vision for what they wanted their city to be like and where transport contributed to that vision. They all had a clear set of policy objectives, and interestingly, as I'll come on to in a moment, those policy objectives were pretty similar across the 9. They all had very active public and business engagement. They were all taking a long-term perspective, typically 15, 20 years, bearing in mind that transport infrastructure has an impact over that period. They all showed a willingness to take challenging decisions, even where there was public opposition to some of the measures in the short term. And they all had, and this for us was absolutely critical, they had both strong political leadership and strong professional leadership. And it was those two that really drove what we saw on the ground in those case study cities. In terms of the approaches they adopted, they were all historic cities, so they had similarities with York. They were reasonably similar in size. They were all seeing the need to encourage growth, economic growth, but at the same time to protect heritage. So that balance was critical to what they were all doing. They all wanted development that was sustainable. They wanted to provide for well-being for all the citizens. And they all, as I mentioned, the common objectives, they all included tackling climate change, tackling pollution, tackling congestion, equality of access, fairness in the transport system, support for and promotion of public health, tackling congestion, and, as I say, supporting heritage. They all, and this was something that we've been pursuing in our comments on the local plan, they've all made a major focus on integrating transport and land use. So the way in which you develop a city influences the demand for transport, and the way in which you invest in transport influences the way the city develops. And that for us was critical. They all made sure that all of the modes of transport were working in a complementary way to support one another, and that the most appropriate use was made of each mode. And with car use in particular, that was then a focus on provision of car use for disabled people who had no alternative, for longer journeys, for journeys that involve carrying substantial loads, and then encouraging alternative modes for other car journeys. And then finally, in terms of the strategic approach, if you like, they all set out very clearly what their performance indicators were for each of their objectives, predicted what they would expect to happen, and then monitored against those. So that, for example, if you know what level of reduction in carbon that you need, as we now do from the climate strategy, monitoring performance against that regularly, annually, and saying, are we getting there? Do we need to do more? I think I'll more or less stop there, except just to pick up Flick Williams' comment, because we did look, I mean, this was an overview, so we weren't looking in detail at any particular policy, but we did look at the question of access for disabled people. As I say, all the cities saw that as a particularly critical issue, and all of them saw that as one of the more important uses of the private car. And particularly in the case of two of the UK cities, they managed to tackle the problem that York has had of the police saying you can't have anybody in your protected area in a vehicle, and actually find a way of enabling disabled people to gain access. And that was one of the more detailed areas where we felt that the council could learn from others. But I'll stop there, Sharon. I'm very happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much for that. Just for a bit more. Sorry. Apologies. Thank you for that presentation. If I may, just for a bit more clarity. So it says in the background report here, or the covering report, that the trusts were invited by council officers in April 2021. Which council officers were you liaising with at the time?
Well, as I remember, I mean, the initial working group was led by James Gilchrist, But at this particular time, it was Claire Fole who was particularly interested in the communication aspects of what we were doing, and using case studies to help members of the public in the city understand what other cities were doing. So it was my recollection, and forgive me, this is 20 odd months ago. It was that discussion and that April meeting that led to our doing this.
Thank you. I'm only asking that so I can get a sense of where in the council it sort of connects to. And obviously we've had quite an unusual last 2 or 3 years, and not just in York. But you seem to suggest that certain or much of the work has sort of not moved since this initial work was done. Nothing more has happened since 2021. Do we know why? Have you had contact still with the council, or I'm just trying to work out?
I don't know why. I've had throughout 2021, I had monthly meetings with the officers directly responsible for the local transport plan, and I raised this quite often. And I guess there were other more pressing needs, and that same team were then dealing with the local plan and its transport aspects as well. But I can't say more than that. I mean, and I just reminded officers that this was an offer on the table, which we would be happy to respond to if they picked up. But bear in mind, the work is done by our transport advisory group, 16 of us with expertise in different aspects of transport, but we're all volunteers. And so there's a limit to what we can offer to do with the time available to us.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Can I add to that, Chair?
Absolutely.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I think also it goes back to your previous question around the conversation we had around where these 9 case studies were asked for. So they were, as Tony said, it came from Claire in her Claire Foles as then comms and marketing manager for the council, and it was around that ability to engage a wider set of population of the city in other case studies that are going forward. So it was obviously very much related to transport, and officers, but I think the ask and where we responded to was within Claire's comms team, and then how we take that forward to engage people. So I think certainly when we put them forward, it was very much around how can they be a bit helpful in wider engagement with transport discussions using other cities, and that's where I think that's sort of blockage, how you describe it. Nothing moved further forward. I think I presume, well, COVID came, other things are happening as well, but it was around transport, but it was principally around engagement. That was the real interest.
Thank you, Councillor Looker.
Yes, I mean, I've read this with extreme interest. I am absolutely fascinated by transport solutions. One of the issues that seems to me that's always hugely significant, and York has tried a number of occasions to put various things on the table, is how to make maximum buy-in from the general public. I have found after many years that in a sense, a diktat from on high doesn't always get terribly good buy-in. I wondered if your experience of these cities, particularly probably the English ones, had a comment on how they had engaged with the public to get some sort of buy-in, if they have succeeded in doing that. Transport policies are always terribly contentious. Everybody believes they've got a right, as from God himself or herself, to drive their car wherever they want, almost at whatever speed they want. But I just wondered if you could comment on the tactics used by some of your cities that you've visited.
Yes, certainly. And I can go a bit beyond our 9, because think my last major bit of European research that I was involved in before I really retired was helping advise cities on how to develop what the European Commission calls sustainable urban mobility plans. And one of the strands of that was how you make participation in its broadest sense as effective as possible. And I think the messages that come out of that, you really have to have buy-in right from the word go. I mentioned vision and objectives. And if you can agree on what it is you're wanting to try to achieve, then it's easier to get into the next level of discussion of how you get there. Whereas if you start off with a discussion of shall we have another grove somewhere else in the city, if you've not set out why you want to do it, and you've not got buy-in to those reasons, it's harder to achieve that. So starting from the outset with vision and objectives and broad strategies, I think is crucial. The other interesting thing, and I learned quite a bit from this study, there's an organization called the International Association for Public Participation, and it has a hierarchy of levels of engagement, starting off with providing information. And second level is consulting, seeking people's views on something. The third involves more direct engagement in discussion of those questions, a sort of focus group approach. And then you get up to a level which is more interactive consultation. And then the fifth level, which I don't think many of our cities ever got to, was the idea of co-creation, where you get people in the local area actually to say, this is what we're going to do, and let's go and do it. But it was that fourth level that led to our establishing our Citizens Transport Forum, which you may have seen something of, where we had 100 people selected from across York, different age groups, male and female, people using different forms of transport, different parts of the city. And we learnt from that very early on that if you get people together from those different backgrounds, sitting down and discussing together, you get much closer to a sense of consensus than ever you do by saying, right, this is what we're proposing to do, what do you think about it? So that for me, sorry, it's a rather long answer, but that for me is the key. And I'm delighted to see that this set of webinars that we're now engaged in is beginning to move in that direction.
Thank you very much for that. I'm really interested in your levels of engagement, because I've come across that before somewhere and I could never remember exactly how it worked. You've encapsulated it beautifully. But I
happy
think
to
it's
provide the
something-
background on that.
I really think that's something very useful. I have given the idea to, I don't know, at least 3 chief executives of the City of York Council in my time. None of them have taken any notice of it. I remain hopeful, I'm always hopeful, that the next one will embrace the idea with enthusiasm.
Thank you, Councillor. Look, I've got Councillor Dave Taylor now.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm on now. Thank you, Chair. It is extremely interesting to have these 9 city comparisons, and I think we should all be really pleased that we have a civic society which has been willing to put so much time and effort into compiling a report like this. So thank you to Dave, thank you Tony, thank you to all the members of the Transport Committee who've engaged in this for our benefit. That's a good bit. I have to question you, Tony, about the strategy. I think it's fairly easy, actually, for us to say, yes, we all agree with these great strategic aims. We all want less congestion. We all want less pollution. We want sustainable growth. I'm not surprised, frankly, that all 9 cities have very similar strategic objectives. It is actually when you come to the detail that things start to become difficult. The devil is in the detail. So it's the moment you start to say, we're going to close this bridge. A lot of us in the room will know how damaging and difficult that was for the city. The moment you put concrete bollards all around an area, a residential area of the city, it becomes really problematic. So, of course, I read through your report and I looked thoroughly for this sort of holy grail of how a city can reduce congestion without making it impossible for residents to get a plumber to their house or a care worker or to get deliveries from the supermarket. And I don't think I'm getting a full answer to that. So maybe you might be able to help me with that. I was intrigued with the concepts in the Delph piece about cars as guests. I'd like that concept because it still means that cars can go there if they really have to, but they are subservient to the forms of transport. And then the Ghent piece, and Ghent, of these cities, Ghent is probably the city I know the most about. And I know people who live there, and I know people who have problems with the concepts of cells, because I think cells present firstly, it gives an impression of putting your residents in some sort of prison, but the cells present a major obstacle for tradespeople and deliveries, and I didn't fully understand, well, I didn't understand how people can get around those obstacles. So I'm sorry, I'm delving into detail, but I'm a detail kind of man. I'm not a broad brush strategy kind of man. I'll leave that to other people who do it better. But if you can help, particularly with that idea of how people get a care worker to their home, how those people can cross the city to visit different clients, how a plumber can get about. Those are the sorts of real things that ordinary people get worked up about.
Well, there's a lot in the question, and I'm not sure I can go into the detail on all of it. I mean, at a high level, I think I stress the importance of having an integrated approach to all modes of transport. If you're concerned about congestion, as I was saying in the webinar last night, there's a nice little rule of thumb which says if you can get rid of 15% of the traffic, you have no congestion. Actually, we're talking in the draft local transport strategy about reducing car use by 20% for climate reasons. So that would get you to about the same point. So that's quite a useful pointer to what might be needed. And of course, that immediately says that 85% of the traffic, 80% of the cars are still in use. So we're not saying you can't use your car anywhere. But in order to get there, you need a mixture of sticks and carrots. And the carrots need to be things like improving walking and cycling and improving public transport. But also, and this is where I go back to the interaction between transport and land use, designing communities so you don't have to travel long distances to do what you need to do. You've got community facilities, you can get to the shops and the community centre and so on within 15, 20 minutes. And then you get on to what do you need to do in order to make the choice for people at the margin as to whether they're using car move from using the car to using something else. And there are various ways of doing it. And parking controls and parking charges are probably the most common. But obviously it's a bit difficult to do that more widely in the city than around the city centre. The idea that Ghent has is a further development of that, and it's saying you can drive into and out of each area in the city, but you can't drive through from one to the other. And so your plumber, for example, can still get to your house to repair that leak that you're worried about. but they come round the inner ring road or the outer ring road and in. They don't go from that part of the city to the next part of the city by driving right through that area. So it's reorienting that traffic, and by doing it, making the longer distance journeys, the people who for the moment would come down the Shipton Road and round the inner ring road and then out on the whole road, not necessarily from out of York to out of York, but to get to the university, for example, realize that actually their journey is better made. They're going to use the car by going around the outside and coming in.
I think that does partially answer my question, particularly about, say, a plumber, maybe not for a delivery driver. Could I ask another question? Thank you for that, Tony. The report seems quite down on the idea of road pricing. It's mentioned in a few places, and it's not greeted with positive view. It's a fairly negative view of road pricing. For some tradespeople, a road pricing might actually be better than cells or blockages, because they could still trade, but they would perhaps have to pass on those additional costs. What's your view about road pricing?
Well, when you said the report, I take it you're meaning this rather than.
I was actually meaning the collection of city studies.
Well, we didn't say much about road pricing there because none of those cities was actually using it, although interestingly, Cambridge has since decided to explore that as a possibility.
There were a few references, but they seem to be fairly.
Yes, but what we do look at it in the fuller report, and this is on the website, and I think you've all in the dim and distant had copies of this, but happy to provide more if you would like them. We raise this in two ways. First of all, it is another way of tipping that balance. So getting people at the margin to think, actually, it makes more sense for me to use public transport rather than to continue to drive. And it's from there that, and the experience of cities who've done it, Stockholm, for example, that you find that 15% rule. If you pitch the charge so that you get a 15% reduction in traffic, then you're pretty well congestion free. But we raised it in here as one of the ways of managing car use, and indeed managing freight too. But we also raise it critically at the end when what I called our what could go wrong questions. And one of the key what could go wrongs is you don't have the money to do things. And crucially, the cities that have introduced road pricing, London being an obvious example, have used that revenue, and the revenue can be quite significant, to invest in the alternatives. So dear old Ken Livingstone, when he introduced congestion charging in London back in 2003, substantially increased the bus service and paid for that with the revenue from road pricing. And immediately on doing it, made the package more politically and publicly acceptable because people could see something for what they were spending. So we raise it at least as importantly here as a way of tackling the very serious finance problem that the council is going to have with its local transport strategy. And to say, we didn't go out on a limb and say you must do it. What we said was, it would be a good idea to commission a study now to look at how it might be used and what its impacts might be, both in terms of transport and in terms of finance.
No, thank you. There's a lot less negative than I imagined.
Chair, can I just add one thing to Councillor Taylor? He was asking about the Holy Grail, very grand thing to look for. And there is no Holy Grail, obviously, and nor were the 9 case studies we looked at universally simple and universally accepted. But I think the value of looking at case studies for York is where we want to have those robust conversations, or we want to have some trialing and testing of challenging decisions. Cities have already been through it in lots of ways and have different perspectives on it. And I think actually us looking outside of York to learn from others is one of the values of having case studies from both UK and Europe to allow us to really explore some of those decisions. So I don't think there's a holy grail. I think there's a pathway to the Holy Grail that actually is about learning from others on your journey that you go through. And I think case studies like this, we think, offer a really valuable example of ways that we could learn without quite simply.
Thank you. Councillor Cuthbertson, and then I've got a question.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I think these studies are very interesting. The problem I've got is that they're now at least 2 years old. And I suppose the question for me is, how do we update them? But there's a more deep question, which is, how do we draw some from them? Those points, those approaches, which are of immediate, they have a guarantee of success almost. I'm sorry about that. It's not a holy grail, but guarantee of success might be the same kind of concept. But actually, the odds are stacked in its favour in terms of success. How do we draw those from these studies? Where do we draw the learning from and apply it? And I don't know, is James with us tonight? Sorry, you were out of my line of sight. So it may be that James has got a view on that, but I think it will be interesting to have your thoughts on that and then to maybe work them up with the James and his team.
Taking the first point first, they are now 2 years old, and they would need to be updated. We said right from the outset, here are 9 in outline, and we would be happy to work up 2 or 3 in more detail, particularly if we have the professional contacts in those cities, which in some cases we didn't have. And that could still be done. But it does need a decision from within the council as to which of the 9 would be of most interest. And that might have changed over time, but if that decision were made, and my colleagues tend to get a bit frustrated about things like this, but I suspect I might be able to twist a few arms and take 2 or 3 of them further detail. In terms of what would be a surefire winner, I think that's probably a slightly over optimistic question. I would take it in 2 stages. What looks as though it might work, and then analyze how it would work in York. So to go back to Councillor Taylor's question about Ghent, and one of the most frequent questions is, could we just apply that traffic cell type system in York? And no, you couldn't, because Ghent has a middle ring road, roughly where Clifton Bridge is, and we all know that there was a plan to build that, but it was never there in its entirety. And I don't think any local authority is going to build that now. So York's network is different. But you could quite readily, with the tools available to the council, say, what would happen if we implemented something like that, that just put some barriers to orbital movement in that area of inner York? And you could test that and tweak it and come up with a package that looked as though it was going to have the maximum benefit for the minimum pain. And then obviously, going back to Councillor Taylor's comment about closing bridges and so on, you have to start discussing whether that's acceptable or not, but at least you've got the evidence, A, that other people have done it, and B, how it might work here. So, sorry, long answer, but I don't think there's an immediate shopping list from these that you would go for.
I'll just continue for a moment, Chair. It strikes me that because those studies are not seriously out of date, but I'm assuming that things have moved on elsewhere. Is it worth updating them to a common level of up-to-dateness, and then picking from those which are the low-hanging transport fruit that might be worth a bet?
Well, I'm sure if somebody wanted to do that, it would make eminent sense. I'm not sure I could readily go back to my colleagues and say, you did all this work 2 years ago, how about updating it all? But if that was something to be shared with council officers, then absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so may I add to that. I think there is definite benefit in doing it, as Tony says. I think there's also something around understanding the differences. Going back to your golden, the low hanging fruit, because a lot of we can draw from the case studies is what works for those cities. Actually, as part of this is understanding the differences between those cities and York, and then which of the questions you want answered to choose the case studies to work up. I think it is about trying to identify what ones would give us the best results in terms of a specific question, rather than perhaps just holistically looking. Because I think some of them, and the reason why partly there was 9 was each one offers something different, but it has differences to what it is possible with York. So there's a little bit of a matrix there, I think, to work out which ones you would take forward.
I think my point was that in the same way that the pandemic has affected us in one way in York, it may very well have allowed other cities to move on in a different way, and their view of what works or what didn't work is changing or has changed, and they might see the way it is going to change, and that might be a useful thing for us to build in. I happen to agree with your views about orbital connectivity within York. I think that connectivity should be outside York and radio access within that, but that's just my untutored opinion. Thank you very much. That was interesting.
Thank you. I want to talk about politics. Obviously, this area of policy is complicated enough as it is until you throw in loads of politicians. And I'm wondering if out of the cities you've looked at, there are particularly good examples of cities that are, if you like, politically finely balanced, that might switch control every election or every 2 elections, and how they've still managed to keep that shared vision and clear strategy. Because that's possibly I'm downplaying it. I think it is an issue in this city that we have topsy-turvy administrations, and that could possibly sabotage medium and long-term plans. And I think it's something we all need to get our heads over and get our heads around. So are there any examples of best practice of politicians putting the greater good first?
Well, in fairness, Chair, there was a very good example in York, because one of the things that we had operating throughout 2021, which some of you will have been party to, was an informal all-party members group discussing the work that we were doing. And I had a sort of 80-20 rule that 80% of the tools that Councillor Custom was looking for, everybody around the table would sign up to. There's 20%, which is politically contentious. And I guess I was disappointed, but not altogether surprised, that as we got closer to the election, even that 80% was difficult to sign up to. But if following the election, an all-party group could try and identify that 80% and say, let's do this anyhow while we debate what's in the rest of it, I think that would be really helpful. In terms of our case studies, I suppose the really useful message from the continental cities is they tend to have far more political parties and therefore have to operate by coalition. And the coalitions tweak somewhat with each election, but there's more continuity. The other slight, well, more than slight problematic aspect with the UK cities is that the governance structures are very different. And in some ways, York has the twin benefits in that it's a unitary authority and it only has an election every 4 years, and that ought to make life a bit easier. But of course, some of our cities aren't unitaries. Oxford, working with Oxfordshire, So you have to have a political agreement across the hierarchy. Others that are part of, like Bath, part of mayoral combined authorities, which of course, well, we're moving. So that complicates things somewhat. But at the end of the day, there is the potential for political consensus. And if once one gets away from an election, you can start finding ways of building that. That potentially should help.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Pearson and then Councillor Luckett, and then I'll probably wrap this item up just because we have two more. But I think we could go for hours, to be honest.
Thanks, Chair.
Oh,
Yeah.
and forgive me, Councillor Pearson. James Gilchrist, council officer, joined the table. I wasn't sure if you joined just for comfort purposes. But do you want to Yeah, if that, yeah, sure thing.
At the end, you can do it now.
No, fine.
No,
Fine.
it was just to say, I think on a couple of points. So in answer to your question, going through them in order, I think the political point is very apt, and far be it from me as an officer to be political in a response. But I think if we can gain more buy-in and consensus on what the plan is for the city from residents, to a certain extent, that makes it easier for political parties to reach agreement as well. So I think that is a really important part of what our current approach is about, is that engagement with the wider city on what the plan is. And part of the approach we've taken in terms of the transport strategy is to focus on those overarching top level priorities in terms of climate change, economic strategy and local plan, because to a certain extent, our transport strategy and local transport plan needs to be subservient to make sure we deliver those climate ambitions, to make sure we deliver what we need for the local plan in terms of those ambitions. So I think that's that. And then the only other comment I was just going to make is that it was actually credit to Councillor de Gorn who set up that informal cross-party group, which met whenever it was in 2020, 2021. And then full council liked that idea and set it up through a sort of formal appointment. So there is a cross-party group. I don't think there's anyone here who sits on it apart from Councillor de Gorn from memory, but Councillor Kilbane does attend. And that cross-party group still meets, and there's a meeting next Thursday, I think, from memory. So it is still a live process where we're trying to gain consensus. And the draft transport strategy that went to executive went through that group first. They all commented on it first before it went to executive.
Thank you, James. Well, Councillor Pearson and Councillor Luckett.
Thanks, Chair. It was actually a bit of a supplementary to your own question, which was how obviously going forward we're expecting to get devolution and well with the North Yorkshire Mayor. We're just wondering how LTP4 and other plans and transport strategies will work within that new sort of combined authority and the new transport powers that the Mayor has, and if you think it's a good thing, and if you think there'll be a good level of cooperation with the North Yorkshire districts, and which is a big area, obviously. So.
Thank you. And this is something that we've been quite exercised about. On the plus side, there is a requirement, as I understand it, to produce a joint provisional local transport plan, LTP4, for York and North Yorkshire by March next year, which then gets sign off in due course by the Mayor. And it brings with it the potential for significant increase in funding for transport. The potential minus side is that rural North Yorkshire and urban York have very different needs. And getting a balanced approach which satisfies both types of need and invests effectively in the best, most cost-effective ways of meeting those needs is absolutely crucial. And I know discussions are underway because I've talked on occasion to colleagues in the council who are involved in those discussions, and it's been suggested I might join the next, well, not the next weekly meeting, but one towards the end of the month, just to listen in on what's happening on that. But there will be areas where there are conflicting needs between the two, and this whole question of car use in York be one, because you can quite see that rural North Yorkshire residents might like to be able to drive right into the centre of York, and yet the citizens of York might well want a different sort of solution. So those need to be resolved, and they need to be resolved really in advance of March next year, which is why we've been encouraging early action on getting York's views on what we as a city want for our transport.
Thank you. Councillor Lucan.
Yes, I just want, one is just a comment. I have been involved in at least two big projects, which did cross elections and changes of administration. One was the decision to move here, which was taken by, I can't remember who was in charge at the time, but it certainly survived pretty well. At least two changes of administration, because it took quite a long time to pull together. And the other was the stadium, which again was quite a long-term project, but did manage eventually to survive a number of administrations. So not all is lost. But I just wondered, actually, York has experimented with its own little cell. For those of you who live in the city centre, I don't know if you've had a look at the Groves, which has created this complicated no-through traffic zone, which quite small, but it took quite a lot of doing. And you're quite right, it had to engage a lot of residents, but it had enormous buy-in from an enormous number of people who lived in the area. I wondered if you had any comment on how you think that has worked.
My apologies, I missed the very end of the question.
Do you have a comment on how the Groves, is that a sort of model for that sort of system?
In part, yes. When I was talking at the webinar last night on managing the road network, I was talking about the case for dualling the outer ring road. And part of the council's case, it goes back to Councillor Cuthbertson's comments, is that if you dual, then you can get quite a bit of traffic out of inner York. But if you look at the consultants' predictions, the maximum reduction in traffic they predict in inner York is about 7% on Gillygate, which is neither here nor there in terms of the scale of the problems. So you've got to do other things as well. And what I proposed last night, which is in our strategy, is a 4-point strategy, of which part is managing queues out near the park and ride sites so that you get bus priority. Bitter's whole road was designed to operate. It doesn't quite do it now, but so that people, when they get to the park and ride site, can see the queue and decide that it's clearly more sensible. So that's the first thing. The second, and it comes on from yours, is making orbital movements in inner York more difficult. And basically the Groves was a route to bypass Lord Mayor's Walk. And it's been, in terms of its impact on the community, in terms of livability, it's been really very successful. If you look at our big conversation consultation, 60 or 55% of respondents were saying they were concerned about intrusive traffic. 60% about noise, 50% about visual intrusion. All of those are an aspect of the impact of other people's traffic on your residential street. And the Groves reduced traffic through those two streets by about 80%. Now, unfortunately, we don't know where that other traffic went, because there were a few flaws in the before and after study. So we don't quite know what happened on Hades Terrace or on Lord Mayor's Walk, surprisingly. But when that's been done elsewhere, there's quite a lot of evidence that some of the traffic, quotes, disappears. And to the extent that it is, quotes, disappearing and doing other things, shorter journeys, using public transport, walking and cycling, then that's moving in the sort of direction we need to go. So, sorry, again, it's a longish answer, but more of that type of scheme to help achieve the 20% reduction, but at the same time to allow the city to benefit and its communities to benefit from that reduction.
Thank you. I've got a hand from James, then the very last question from Councillor Dave Taylor before we wrap up.
I think just two points I was going to make, and I accept the paper is 2 years out of date. My field trip to Ghent was 2018, so even further out of date. But when I was there, I think the important thing to remember is that the Ghent model works on a camera enforcement model. So unlike the Groves, where we've got physical measures in place, the Ghent model works, or it certainly did when I was there, on a model of enforcement through a camera and a £50 fine with potential for exemptions. So that to a certain extent comes back to the question you were asking. At the moment, and I know the government are looking at changes, but at the moment that model is only deliverable in London at the moment for low traffic neighbourhoods, but they are contemplating changes to transport legislation. But it's important to understand the subtlety of the difference. Now, interestingly, Birmingham's local transport model, which is a nice diagram if you look at it, also works on that principle of segments of a city which you can go into and go out of, but only certain modes can travel between those cells, let's call them. So just to be clear, there's just a difference about the way they're implemented in the city at the moment because of the legislation.
Thank you, Councillor Dave Taylor.
That's really helpful and valuable, James. Thank you. And that could potentially resolve the issue with doctors and care workers and plumbers and all that. I just wanted to say, I think this 9 Cities report is very interesting. I think all of us around the table agree it's interesting. I would like it to be valuable for York as well as interesting. And you, James, and you, Tony, and possibly others have said to engage with the public is a first, it's a primary thing. And I therefore wonder whether there is still an opportunity, even though the work is 2 years old, there is still an opportunity to get wider media coverage of these studies in a bigger discussion about transport in York. Do you have any views on that? Either you, Chair, or James or Tony?
Well, I do have, it sort of touches on where I was going to go. I was going to make a recommendation, but I'll hear from, was it James? Yeah.
I'm happy to do an initial comment. Obviously, when executive sort of adopted perhaps a bit strong, approved the draft local transport strategy whenever it was a month ago, they're basically what they were saying was we now need a load of engagement with the city. So the joint piece of work the Council and Civic Trust are doing around those webinars to engage people and talk about these studies is exactly the start of that, and that is going to ramp up over the summer. As ever, engagement is trying to reach beyond those people who want to talk to us about transport, about those people to make it, to come back to the point, is to make it valuable for you as politicians to reach consensus on it.
Thank you, James. Tony.
Well, just to add to that, I'm delighted that Claire Fole is joining our Transport Advisory Group meeting when we meet on Thursday next week to discuss precisely this and how the trust can contribute. And one of the things we'd like to pursue then is whether the council can build on our experience with our Citizens Transport Forum, which we ran ourselves with some charitable support. But potentially, I think, is a really good model for hearing about what other cities are doing, but also discussing what best York could do. And that could operate at a citywide level, it could operate at a ward level. It could do both. Just one other, just quick comment on James's comment on ANPR and traffic cells. The really interesting one to watch, I think, and it's really contentious at the moment, as you may have seen, is Oxford, which is proposing 4 or 5 modal filters at key points on the road network. So it's never going to be traffic cells in the Ghent sense, but to spot the places where that long distance traffic is causing greatest problem. And as I understand it, their intention is to enforce that with ANPR and to have exemptions. One of the ideas which would be that everybody has an allowance of so many journeys past that point each year, and they use them as they think best, but once they do more, they get fined for the privilege. So keeping an eye on that, I think, would be really useful.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, we do of course have a model of that in the bus gates we have in the city where we allow buses through but not cars. So that is the one exception where we can do that sort of enforcement. And you could do that potentially in a cell model.
Thank you. I'm open to steer from colleagues, and Councillor Dave Taylor has put something forward himself, but I think my main, from your opening gambit, I suppose, my main concern was there's some good work that's gone on here. I totally accept it's all led by volunteers, and you're not a sort of bottomless pit of capacity. But equally, I don't know about colleagues on the table, I often hear from officers that they have no time to think and they only have time to do. And I think it's something we need to do more of in reaching out to expert external partners to use that expertise to its maximum. And it's just that, notwithstanding there's been other pressures across the board, it is a shame that things haven't moved much since 2021. I still think the work is very valuable. I wouldn't downplay that. I mean, a year and a bit's not that long. The world hasn't changed that much. So I sort of wanted, I haven't got the exact word in here, colleagues, but I wanted to sort of maybe suggest a recommendation to the exec member for transport to specifically pick up this work in its current stage. I know that there's work going on outside of formal meetings. You've got this informal cross-party group that Claire Fall's attending, but just to formalise it again and get it back on the official forward plan, recommend to the executive member that this work is picked up again and next steps are agreed to keep it moving forward. So you've mentioned that you could do a deeper dive into maybe 2 or 3 case studies, or perhaps looking at the low-hanging fruit as Councillor Cuthbertson described it. I know that's also putting work onto you. This is my attempt to try and make sure that this keeps moving. What do members around the table think? If I'm missing something or not quite wording it right, please just tell me, put me out my misery. Councillor Looker?
No, I'm quite happy. I would very happily endorse it. I think you're right. I think we've got to keep this moving. And in a sense, trying to create now some formal structure that will go forward over into the next administration prevents it perhaps just falling into a bit of a black hole again, because we all know there's an election coming up. So really trying to say, let's have something happen now, might just carry it over the hump.
Tony and Andrew, would you have any particulars to add to what I've put forward? I know it's fairly vague what I've raised, but
No, I think we'd be very keen to look at a smaller number of case studies, and as long as there was a good use for them,
yes.
and as long as
yes.
we did that, we worked with council officers in James's team beforehand to agree what they were. Because I think that's crucial. It's no point, it's no good enough spending our time saying, okay, we'll give you 3 options. There you go. Actually, they've got to have a use for you, and they've got to have a benefit for the city. And I think they've got to be done through cooperation to start with, and then we can take some of that load and work them through. But I think going back to what Tony said at the very beginning, the success of the case studies we looked at was around strong political leadership and strong professional leadership. And I think actually working together is very much part of that. So absolutely, we'd be very keen to do it. I think it's got to have it's got to have strong use for you, be useful. And I think from our point of view, it has to be done very much as in a cooperative way. I think that'd be really useful. There's no point in us telling you what to do.
Thank you, Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think it sounds like a good recommendation, and I'd like to see that cooperation with Civic Trust and other city partners. I think the only thing I maybe add is to include something around that public buy-in that we talked about at the very beginning. Councillor Lucker mentioned it at the very beginning. That in those case studies that we look at, that how public were brought along with the process is perhaps a key part of those smaller set of case studies.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Pearson. Okay, so I'm going to try and have an attempt at wording. So recommendation to the Executive Member for Transport to work with the Civic Trust and relevant officers. So we know that James and Claire Fold have been involved so far on taking this report further with 2/3 deeper case studies and maybe a particular focus on how to build public buy-in to medium, long-term transport strategies. Can't get my words out tonight. I'm comfortable enough with that, and I trust the executive member and officers to make good of that. I'm sure you will. But thank you for your time. Tony, go on.
Sorry, Chair, just one very quick addition to what Andrew said, and I wholly agree with everything he said about willingness to help and to share that wider set of skills that we can draw on. But thinking about my colleagues' reactions, I think the crucial thing next time is to be clear what the council will be doing with the case studies.
Yeah.
If always assuming that the case study proves useful, because there's nothing worse than putting a lot of effort in and then seeing nothing happen. So if we can build that into the committee's recommendation, that would be very welcome.
Yeah, I'm absolutely on board with that. Yeah, we'll find the tighter wording, but absolutely agree if colleagues do too. I'm sure we do. There's nothing worse than pointless work. And you know, it was one of the motivations for bringing it to this committee tonight, that it's been sort of on the shelf for quite some time, and that in itself is a shame, but I'm glad we've picked it up tonight. Really appreciate your time and your patience with this whole thing as well. And I hope you get to enjoy the rest of your evening. Cheers. I'm sure you enjoyed this bit too, of course. Right. Okay. Now, I'm minded to jump straight to the next item unless anyone needs a comfort break. Okay, we'll keep going. So the next item is on city centre cafe licenses. And presenting this, we have a trio of guests. Let yourselves get comfortable. We almost need interlude music for these bits, don't we? Okay, so similar to last time and every other report we get, if you just want to introduce yourselves, and I'm not sure who wants to give a brief summary of this report, but we'll play to your tune and then we'll raise any questions.
Ashley Mason, Executive Owner for Economy and Strategic Planning. I think this gives you quite a good and actually quite up-to-date update on where we are. Obviously, it tells the background of how we got to where we are and how we're dealing with some of the kind of operational things that come up. But I'll let the officers really give you the more detailed answers.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Helen Bergeron. I'm the Traffic and Highway Development Manager for City of York Council. I manage several teams, including the team that does cafe licensing in the city under the Business and Planning Act. And so really this report is following the change in the local guidance that was agreed in December 2022. And we started implementing at the start of 2023. Presenting to you really what this means for the businesses is we've had a reduced number of license applications. That was expected because obviously some of the businesses have realized that they will not get a license under the new requirements. We still have licenses coming in, there are license applications coming in. So I think some businesses are probably also waiting for the better weather. Maybe not this week, but and so I think we'll see some more coming as the spring starts and maybe for the Easter holidays, etc. So far 36, well, at the end of February, 36 licenses had been granted. We had 10 applications refused and 23 were in progress, basically where information was missing or we needed them to review the layout. And we've had 29 breaches recorded. When I say breaches, some of it, very few actually, are license breaches. Most of them are actually businesses that are not licensed and are putting tables and chairs. So that's a slightly different issue for us, but same result for people out there who maybe can't get past. That's about it, I think. That's a summary. We have upcoming change in legislation. We don't know when, obviously, it will come through. Last time I looked, it was still at Lords for, I think, second reading. And this is likely at the moment, as it reads at the moment, to help us a little bit with enforcement, because it would give us a little bit more powers in terms of we'd be allowed to remove the furniture if the businesses are in breach of licenses after obviously giving them notice. There is the question of what would we do with the furniture and where we would store it. Some of the local government associations representations that have been made to the Lords were very much around, can we not just issue fines instead? Because we'd make our life easier as councils, but I don't think that's gone through into the bill at the moment. And the other changes are around a longer consultation period. At the moment, we've only got 7 days, which is very, very short. We are often not able to, people don't even have the chance to notice that there is a notice in the window and then the period has ended. That would move to 14 days, which is still very short compared to planning, which is 28, but would be better. And also, interestingly, for the council, we would be allowed to charge a bit more for the issuing of the license. At the moment, it's capped at £100. We used to charge £660 per license before, so we'll see there's a loss in revenue there. That's it.
Thank you.
I think the only thing I was just going to add is we've talked about the impact on businesses, obviously being the flip side of that, which you've heard from the public speaker tonight, which is the positive impact on the change in policy in terms of the accessibility to the city centre. So just to sort of highlight that impact is there.
Absolutely. Thank you for that opening, officers. I've got Councillor Dave Taylor.
Thank you. Historically, I think I was the first councillor to badger the executive to relax the licensing of pavement cafes, to permit them to trade outside during the pandemic. And eventually the government, of course, introduced the free-for-all that's is now being wound back. But, you know, I think I'm I would be sure that it saved jobs and livelihoods during that period of time. So clearly there have been great positives in trying to capture that continental cafe environment, but also the drawbacks in terms of access for some people with disabilities. Frankly, it's got to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and so license permitted where we can ensure safety and access is the only way forward, and keeping in line with the national legislation, as you've said. So I'm very happy with the report. I would just ask the question which related to A boards. The public speaker mentioned A boards. It was something that we banned from the city centre. Has any of the enforcement action that has been taken recently been about A boards? I'll switch this on.
Sorry. So A boards are separate, obviously, from the cafes, although sometimes cafes do have A boards as well, so we have to enforce both. We have officers who roam the city, several times a week. It's obviously limited because we've got limited resources, and we will go in and tell people to take their A boards out of the web. Obviously, as soon as we disappear, we don't know what happens. And for further enforcement, it's really the same as the pavement cafe. It's around the Highways Act and highway obstruction. So I've summarised in the report. This needs to go to magistrates' court. So it's quite a cumbersome way of enforcing.
Okay.
It might be something that, if I remember right, what James told me, but I think is it in London, they've got a totally different regime for how they can enforce A boards, and it's much easier in terms of like fixed penalties and things. So it's a shame basically that London has a much more streamlined process, which probably makes it easier to deal with than we've got here.
Thank you. Councillor Looker?
Yes, I was going to say actually that I have noticed A boards are slightly creeping back. There was a sort of total wipeout when the ban was originally put in, but I have noticed that and I was wondering whether you just sort of were turning a bit of a blind eye, but perhaps not. No, I'm pleased that you are still looking at that one. I challenged David Taylor to be the first person. I was promoting the joys of Mexico City, I remember, some years ago, as a place where you could really sit out and mind you, the climate's better. It is gorgeous. The issue I wanted to pick up, and it sort of comes in your current policy, where you talk about pavement outside licenses can engage on the pavement, particularly in foot streets where you are confident that there's passage up the main middle of the road. But we did have a case just that was highlighted in the press recently, and I hope you had taken that on board, where there probably was access in the middle of the road, but the two disabled parking ramps leading off the pavement have both been blocked. And I hope when you are looking, I notice in paragraph 12, you're talking about reviewing an application because of the sighting. I hope you're taking that on board. We cannot have pavement cafe tables preventing people coming down off the pavement into the road if they need to do so, because that is just ridiculous. So can you assure me that that is something you are taking really high notice of?
So that is part of the updated policy that was adopted at the end of 22. Now we have to have 1.5 meter on the footways, which means that you will be able to continue to where a drop curb is available. That was the issue we had with cafes on footways, where maybe we didn't have drop curbs. Some of the streets, like Goodram Gate, don't have many drop curbs at all. And so the change in guidance meant that now we're able to say that. So the only place we would allow a pavement cafe to be licensed taking the whole width of the footway is if the street is level, so there's no curb to get on and off.
Thank you. Councillor Cuthbertson.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I didn't get my papers until late, and I'm curious to know, has the legislation actually been passed? Obviously, do we know what roughly the timetable is?
far be it from me to curse this government, but I don't think we can be certain. It's worked its way through certain phases. And as Helen says, it's currently with the House of Lords at the moment, who will presumably pass it back at some point and go with like these changes. Whether that will go back and forth, because whilst York obviously is well publicised in the challenges we've had, you know, you can go to any city and talk to my contemporary and talk about the same issue they've had. You know, some of the solutions we initially looked at were the same. So, you know, we pinched them from Westminster when we were trying to find solutions to this problem. So it is something that has happened in every city in response to the way the legislation has evolved.
And can I ask about the legislation? Does it include statutory guidance, or does it just say the minister or the local authority may provide guidance?
So there is already statutory guidance from the government, but this guidance then says that the local authorities have to develop their own local guidance, having regard to the national guidance. So it's a bit of a, just to note on the progress of the bill as well, that it's a much wider bill and it's got really controversial planning proposals. So although there's a small part on pavement cafes, I think the rest of the bill might actually delay it more.
If I may, just two quick follow-ups there.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the bill's a sort of much wider ranging bill, and I suppose the question is it likely to be altered substantially between now and the time it's passed? Do we know that?
We don't know that. At the moment, we've got a temporary regime that ends again at the end of September, because we've already had that 3 times, renewed 3 times now. I'm guessing that if the bill is not passed by the summer, we'll probably get another 1-year extension on the temporary regime, I'm guessing, but that's only my guess.
Thank you. I noticed that there's provision in here for what's called ACT training, which is counter-terrorism training, but I'm not clear. ACT awareness, e-learning course, and that kind of stuff. That's on page 93, the first bullet point. What I'm curious to know is to what extent does the counter-terrorism provision have to be implemented at our level? Is an online course really enough?
I suppose there's a couple of separate things. So it was a choice we made. So there's no statutory guidance about this at all. What we wanted to make sure is that when a business is applying for a cafe license, that they took CT seriously in considering that. So we made that online course a condition of them getting the cafe license.
Okay,
and
so that's a local requirement, local policy requirement.
It's a local policy requirement that executive approved. And just to come back to your previous question, the bill in question, just because we haven't mentioned it, is the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. So it's got all sorts of things in it.
Have some mileage.
It might have some mileage.
Okay.
Yeah.
And lastly, I suppose at the present moment this is administered through planning department, through place directorate.
Through the highway team.
Right, okay, so
Highway, it's licensed on highway.
so my question is there a proposal for that to change to the present licensing team?
At the moment, no, it will be highways deal with their own licensing. So we license all sorts of things in highways, from skips to A-boards to all sorts of things. I'm not sure we do license A-boards actually, but we license a whole raft of things in highways. So at the moment, that's not proposed to change. The temporary legislation purposely removed the requirement for planning permission. So it'd be slightly subversive to make it a planning process. It could potentially sit in the licensing team, but I think it probably sits better in highways licensing, particularly given the pace of change. The one thing that does sit with licensing is I'm 99% certain the executive decision last year said that the ongoing policy would be kept under review by the licensing committee. So it actually was full council that did that, that delegated it to the licensing committee.
Okay, thank you. I think that's very helpful.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thanks, Councillor Cuthbertson. Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Helen and James, for your work. My question relates to paragraph 12 and also paragraph 14 of the report on page 93 of the agenda pack. So I noticed that 10 applications have been refused, and I wondered if you might be able to talk us through like any reasons why they would be refused. And then in paragraph 14, it talks around 29 licence breaches. And again, I just wondered if you would talk us around the issues there. If anyone has been, a breach has been spotted, have they been given a chance to resolve the situation, and what are the next steps for businesses?
Yeah. So in terms of the refusals, they are all linked to the need to provide 1.5 meters on the footways. And it's been generally quite a few businesses on Fossgate, because actually, if you think of the footways on Fossgate, that's quite narrow. And then other locations within the city centre, really. In terms of the breaches, so a few, I think it's 2 or 3 were license breaches where the barriers had not been installed correctly, or were not the correct barriers, or not in the right location. So that is relatively easy for us to address, because we just either go and meet the businesses or write to them explaining what the issue is, and generally that's been corrected. I think the experience from the officers is that sometimes there's different teams on shifts in those businesses, and maybe not everybody's been briefed completely on how the barriers should be set up, so reminding them does the job. The other breaches, the majority of them are around cafes that are continuing to use the area outside their premises without a license. In some cases, I think because they know they will not get a license. So some of these have had now several warnings. So we are looking with the legal team at the next steps in terms of, prosecution. I would rather avoid that, but we will have to issue notices really to.
Are you done?
Well, if I'm allowed to ask another question, it was going to be around in terms of the new sort of regime. Has there been any feedback from businesses around the support that's being offered to them, and the extra information that they're being asked to provide? Is there any feedback from businesses?
So no positive feedback that I can. I think generally they've been appreciative where the team's been on site to help them, think of how they set up their area to make sure that it meets a requirement. But that's generally just a face-to-face meeting. There's been some feedback saying that we were asking for too much information, that it's a bit too much to have the training, but the training is an online course that takes 45 minutes and it's free. So, that's the decision that council made at the time, that it was actually justified. That's about it. I think generally it's been around, how do I set up my area now that I need to leave the 1.5 meter? And that sometimes is quite complex to try and think of a way to do it.
I think the other aspect to it is those businesses that can't have a pavement cafe license now, just because of the space constraints. So they are obviously somewhat disgruntled in terms of the impact that has. But that was, balance of decision making, I guess.
I suppose from an anecdotal point of view is nobody's shouting at me saying, this is a problem, this is disgusting, we can't do this. Obviously, I think we all probably got the same lobbyists when we were looking at making the policy before it went to full council. But I think since then, I think people have, like James says, have kind of accepted that that's what the policy is, and they either work with it or they don't.
Thank you. I've got a few questions, if I may. As we've talked about, well, obviously, tables, chairs come with the pavement cafe issue. We've mentioned A-boards, but things like, I think in this picture, is that some sort of pram that's filled in with plants, and are like similar other accessories dealt with when it sort of crosses the 1.5 meter?
It's an obstruction.
Yeah.
So, but we've written to that business several times. So, yeah, this is part of what we are considering with the legal team.
Okay, so enforcement are engaged in this particular case. Yeah. Thank you. On enforcement, you mentioned, is it roughly 7 rounds a week that the team will do?
Well, so what we've done is we've only got very limited resource. We basically have 2 members of staff who do other things as well. They don't just do pavement cafes, but they focus on pavement cafes. And so one of them will go once and then the other once. So that's 2 rounds. And then what we've done is we're using Goff and Kelly, who currently manage the bollards in the city centre. And they take pictures for us and they give us a report. So that's pretty much every day. If they notice something, they'll just take a stamped photograph, send it to us, so then we've got proof. So that's been quite helpful, actually.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was curious as to how proactive it was or reactive. That's helpful. I had another question or two, I'm sure. Oh yeah, warnings. So let's say somebody's in breach of their license, they get a warning letter. They make adjustments to no longer be in breach. Do they then effectively go back to 0? Or if they do it again a month or 2 later, would it be classed as a second warning?
So what the new policy says is that if it's the same issue, then we are at number 2 warning. But if it's a different issue, which in some cases it is, then obviously we go back to advising them first.
Yeah, and you might think, this lad's been a counsellor for too long for asking you this next question. How are we defining the same issue? So let's say it's a table, but it happens to be 3 meters away from where it was initially. Would that be viewed as the same issue, or would it be a different offence or breach?
I'd have to go back to the guidance document where we list the issues. So it's, the area is not as licensed, or the furniture is not as licensed, or hours in breach of the hours, restricted times, etc. So there's categories in there. I'd have to go back to the list, but that's how we would count.
But you think there's reasonable cover against that kind of
I think so,
silliness?
Yes. But at the moment, as I was saying, the issue is not so much about people who have a license. It's actually about people who don't have a license. So we can't revoke a license that they do not have. So
yeah, thank you. I have one more question, and I'll bring you in, Councillor Pearson. With regards to the national legislation that's coming through at some point, the local government associations representations are cited, and you mentioned that as well. Now, you suggested that their representations might have been based around when you seize this stuff, where do you store it? When I read that, I thought maybe that they're saying that because they don't want the idea of seizing furniture might be more prone to bringing about conflict. Is that part of it as well, or?
I think it's not a good way to deal with businesses, and also imagine if a council team has to go in the street and seize the furniture in the middle of the day. I don't think it works well, really. That's what's proposed in the bill, but a lot of local authorities don't think that's the way it should go. And obviously we would have storage cost. We'd have to probably get a contractor to do it for us. I don't know how we would do it. At the moment, we've been trying to think with the team, how would we do that if that's what's in the bill? We would much rather have the enforcement powers that London has, where we can just issue penalty notices, at 60, 70 quid every time. At some point, I think the businesses will listen. So,
Thank you for that, Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, it was just to capture sort of on that sort of issue. How does the highways enforcement team? How do you get information from the access panel? Do you have sort of a feedback loop with them? And I wonder as well. I know we're putting a lot of pressure on this new recruit, but the access officer, are they involved in the process?
Yes, so the access officer is involved, and we have regular discussions. Sometimes when we've had applications that have come through where we maybe wanted to discuss with them, we've been to see the access officer. Obviously, the panel is quite recently set up, but the idea is to be able to attend regular sessions with the panel, so that if there are any issues, they can raise those issues with one of the officers. And then obviously we can take that back and work with the license holders or the people who don't have a license.
Thank you. Any more questions from colleagues? Okay, I'm not minded to make any heavy recommendation, but I think this would be good to bring back in a year, because this is still really, really fresh, isn't it? And with that in mind, I am grateful for the report. It's been good to have an early look at this new regime. Is that a hand, councillor Pearson?
Yeah,
I was going to say, do you think the legislation will be passed in a year?
indeed, yeah, I was just wondering if it's worth whether yourself and Councillor Mason want to write a letter into the to the government and to get this legislation passed in terms of particularly with regards to being able to fine and having that easier way of controlling the licenses.
I'm open to it. I'd have to read it.
Is that complicated? Because my understanding is this is only a very small part of a much more complicated bill, and some of it I don't want passed at all. So I'm really not suggesting we should do any. I think we just got to wait its turn. It's only a little bit, isn't it, of the whole thing. So it isn't that you're just looking at pavement cafes. So temper your enthusiasm on that.
I think it says the local government association has made that point.
Indeed.
Maybe we can just let it go at that.
I will take the wisdom from my more experienced colleagues. Thank you. But I mean, can we put it on a work plan or the work plan to come back to this in a year? Whoever's in charge of the committee then? Consider it, yeah.
I think it'd be a recommendation to the new committee to. That's why Councillor Crawshaw dealt with it on Monday night, was to make a recommendation to the new committee to consider it on their work plan.
Perfectly worded. Yeah, sound. But thank you again. Really appreciate it. How are members feeling? Do you need a brief comfort break or? We're absolutely flying tonight. I've jinxed it now. We'll be here for another 2 hours. Okay, so we'll move on to the next item, which is highways maintenance, capital programme and major development, highways impacts update, scheduling and planning report. God, that rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Now, for those watching at home, the background to this is obviously, well, it's not obviously, but many people don't know, and they probably need to know that the city has an awful lot of major projects coming up, and that will involve a significant amount of changes, temporary and permanent, to how our roads work. So this is why this report's with us. I'll invite officers to introduce themselves if they haven't spoken already and give a brief summary of it, and then we'll get into questions.
I'll just do a very brief introduction. So what the report tries to set out is we can't see into the future and know every development, when they're going to want road closures, etc. And just to clarify, we don't give a sort of road closure right to York Central, for instance, for the next 2 years. You know, they come through for the specific bits of work. So we can't see into the future for everything. So what we've tried to set out in this report is the process we go through in terms of making those decisions, the things we consider and how we make those decisions. So I'll pass over to Tony, who's put the paper together, and alongside Pavement Cafes, Helen also deals with street work, so she deals with this on a day-to-day basis.
Hello, yes, Tony Clark. I'm the York Central sort of Highway Authority lead, but York Central being one of the largest schemes that are being progressed at the moment, there's obviously a lot of interface with other projects and other utility works around the city. I can run through the details, just run through the report, or I can focus on one particular area. It's up to you.
I'm fairly easy. What the colleagues think.
Run through, right? That's fine. So obviously, summary, then a bit of background on the duties we have to manage the road network under the Traffic Management Act. So that's to keep traffic moving, and it's our role through the New Roads and Streetworks Act to act as a street authority and effectively manage and coordinate all the road and street works that are happening on the network. We've recently introduced a permit-based system. It's been in place for about a year or so. And this system ensures a sort of closer control of the works on the network and ensures that there's an obligation on operators, promoters of schemes to liaise with the council and provide notice on the works that they're planning to take forward, and we have then the duty to coordinate those works. We have quarterly coordination meetings to help that process. So the promoter of a scheme has to provide a notice for, obviously, and there's a range of notices that are required depending on the type of street and the type of works that might be being undertaken, and they range from 3 days for minor works up to 3 months for major works. And major works, that's actually quite a low threshold. It's only 10 days of works on the ground, or where there's a temporary traffic regulation order being needed for that. We issue about 6,000 permits a year, and we use the One Network system roadworks map to publicise those permits and the application for permits, and that's available for anyone online, and residents can sign up for alerts on the website to notify them if there's any planned works on particular streets or areas of the city. I wouldn't recommend, as I say, putting the whole city in, because there's a lot of activity on that. But on a routine basis, the council's transport team manages and monitors the highway network using CCTV and traffic delay tools to enable remote adjustment of signal timings. So that's a day-to-day activity. So if there's incidents on the network, we will look at trying to update the traffic signal timings to adjust traffic flows in the area. We will contact the utility or developer, whoever is impacting on the network, to make sure that they're aware of that. There was an incident this morning around Clifton Green, caused a lot of transport issues across the city, and that was related to some works on the ground where they had overrun and the traffic signals had failed. So our network monitoring officer contacted them and got that activity changed as quickly as we could. Contact is sometimes quite difficult. I'll skip the planned works item just for a moment and come back to that. I wanted to focus on the sort of network management principles that we run through. So if a promoter comes forward with a scheme, I mean, we haven't got the opportunity to refuse. If they come forward with an application and say they need to do some works on the highway, we can't refuse that if they're a statutory undertaker. But we can manage that process and delay the programme, or advise them that it'd be better to undertake the works at a particular time, and then we can issue a permit on that basis. But we haven't got the right to refuse completely the works. For works that we undertake our own schemes, or the major projects that we're talking about, or utilities, we will try and ensure that the schemes are designed to minimise the impact during construction. We'll also look at their methods of delivery, and obviously there's a range of methods of delivery that people can take forward, and traffic management, to minimise the disruption during that construction phase. On programming, we will look at trying to program the work to avoid peak traffic times, obviously, or peak times of the year, or around particular activities or events, race days, Christmas markets, that sort of thing. We also need to manage emergency repairs and events, and think of those if there are incidents while other works are happening on the ground. In terms of routing, we'd look to maintain routes to key destinations, so the hospital and the station. We'd restrict approval of works on diversion routes where if there were main works happening on an area in the city or a particular location where there's closure, we would look at the diversion route to make sure that if an application for a permit came forward, we would consider that, bear that in mind. We'd look at maintaining key pedestrian and cycle routes and public transport routes, and avoid routing diversions or construction traffic through residential areas where at all possible. Other areas of mitigation, we'd look at undertaking traffic modelling. but this tends to be for more major schemes or as a coordination of particular schemes because it takes time to undertake. It's expensive, and sometimes it's because it takes a long time. It's not in place in time to make a decision on those items. But it is very useful for particular items like adjusting traffic signal timings, understanding what a starting point might be if a scheme came forward. We look at the environmental impact of the works, particularly for overnight works and the timing of any works at night and their proximity of residential properties. Also, we would look at for the larger schemes and particularly what we're going through at the moment with the number of schemes that are in place, we look at trying to promote sustainable transport options with the aim of reducing the number of vehicles on the network if at all possible. Maybe an option for provision of supplementary bus routes to maintain access to services and provision of suitable equivalent pedestrian or cycle diversions where practical. The key issue on here is really about communication and making sure people are aware of the schemes that are happening and the impact on the network. So there's sort of formal statutory processes that we have to go through particularly for the temporary traffic regulation orders or items like that. But then there's also extra communication, which we'd expect the promoter of the scheme to progress. So drop-in events, letter drops, leaflets, those sorts of things. We've also been recently involved in a briefing with the local media to highlight this particular issue, and we'll work with them closely to promote schemes and to make sure they're aware of the background behind some of the changes that might be happening. I won't run through the next section in detail, but just to highlight the sort of items that we will consider when a permit comes in, an application comes in. So timing and duration of works, traffic management, what type of traffic management, the impact on pedestrians, the location if there are other activities happening. We wouldn't want to duplicate items. We wouldn't want schemes to progress and then another scheme come forward. We try and make sure that they are done at the same time if at all possible. Location of schemes, whether what other network activities are taking place on the network, the type of work, methodology, and the environmental concerns I've mentioned earlier. Consultation of information that people would be providing, and the potential to reduce network demand. But in particular, it's collaboration. We have a good relationship with the utilities. We have regular coordination meetings to try and run through those items to try and avoid conflicting schemes. So I think that probably covers through most of the items you want to raise. Happy to cover any questions from the committee.
Thank you. Really appreciate that, Tony. I've got a fair few. I'm happy to mix it up though. Councillor Dave Taylor and then Councillor Ed Pearson.
Thank you, Chair. It seems inordinately sensible to have a permit scheme to help schedule these works, but it does seem rather a long wait of 3 months for something described as a major work. If it lasts longer than 10 days, it's a major work. When a major work might just be the resurfacing of a tiny little ginnel that nobody goes down very often. Yeah. Is the definition of a major work, is that not related to the size of the carriageway and the number of people who might use it, rather than just the length of time it would take to do the work?
That's a statutory requirement.
So, okay.
I think, I think just to come back on that, and I think the other bit is that as per our transport hierarchy, where we impact on pedestrians, that's the greatest impact we can have. So we take that most seriously of them all to some extent. A diversion for a car is an inconvenience. A diversion for a pedestrian is potentially much more inconvenient.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Pearson and Councillor Locker.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, and thanks, Tony, for your report. Paragraph 11 on page 98 of the agenda pack talks around the transport modelling. I'm just wondering if you could talk us through what that involves, and then obviously how do the results of the modelling influence what you actually do on the ground?
Yes, the city has a transport model that covers the whole transport network around the city. It's used for the local plan, for instance, for understanding the impact of developments, but it can also be used for the impact of particular road closures or a combination of closures that might be in place at a time. So we have looked at some of the major schemes that are coming forward. So York Central on the ground now, the station frontage, the station gateway scheme, potential scheme that's coming forward for maintenance work on Lendal Bridge, for instance. We would combine those and look at those and see what the impact was. You can look at the impact on journey times, impact on flows around the network. And then, as I say, the primary purpose we would use that for is to look at the impact on traffic signal timings, look at where the particular pinch point hotspots might be for increased traffic levels, and see how we can deal with those.
Can I just a supplementary if I may? Could councillors see outputs of the models and have perhaps some explanation of how they work? And that would be an offline conversation, obviously, but I'm just out of interest.
Yeah, I'm sure that can be arranged.
We have got a piece of work with Scrutiny on the transport model. It may not have been this Scrutiny. I think it might be in the climate change one. But yeah, more than happy for anyone that's interested to show you that. I think the other thing, just to touch on it, is well, it does allow us to do the transport modelling, is potentially identify where there might be additional roads to close to manage the impact. So to avoid people using a diversionary route we don't want them to use. So it allows us to do things like that. So.
Interesting. I was going to ask that same question, really. Councillor Looker. No, I'll wait. Quite enjoying listening to you guys, to be honest.
That's all right. There was a recent headline in the press just recently announcing that York would go into complete traffic chaos for years, I think they predicted. And certainly there are some very, very, very complex and very tricky ones coming up. I'm thinking of the whole stuff around York Central, and we're already on water. I have to remember which it is. It's Water End, isn't it? Seeing some of the traffic implications, and they barely started encroaching. And then, of course, you've got the Lehman Road, which is in a sense the other side of that particular problem. And you've got York Station, which is, taking a bridge out. I'm looking forward to seeing it done. I've never actually seen a bridge taken out before. I've seen you put bridges up, but I've never seen you take bridges out. So, but those three on their own are going to be hugely significant. Are you managing to timetable them so that they don't all happen at once? Because I imagine there's a bit of a follow-on that you have to do that bit first and then that bit and then. But those three strike me as really hugely significant for the city.
Absolutely. The York Central scheme obviously has been on the cards for a long time, but now it is being implemented and we're getting down to the time when it will start to have an impact on how people move around in the areas while the work is being undertaken. And over the next few weeks, starting even next week, there will be more disruption on Lehman Road, and then there's planned works on Water End in March, April time, overnight closures for some work there. And this will extend through for 2 years or so on that particular scheme. And some of the point about the major schemes is that they are bigger schemes and they involve works that once they're in place, on the ground. Once there's traffic management in place, they can't be taken off necessarily. So if there's some changes to a bridge, some parapet improvements, that you can't say, oh well, we'll do some other works, we'll take those off for a period, because they have to be in place throughout that period. The combination and trying to work things together, I think this is, the whole issue is that we have a lot of major works happening over the next few years. They've all come through at a similar sort of time, and we're looking at trying to coordinate them as best we can. So there will be individual elements where we will say works can't happen at the same time, but generally speaking, the projects will overlap.
I think part of the challenge is how we coordinate that activity and how we dictate how it happens. So to use your bridge example as a good example, and Tony might be better placed than me to talk about this, but the principle is that you build a temporary road through the station car park. You can do that offline while the road is running as normal. You will then need a closure to tie it into the two ends, and that requires a closure. Then you can demolish the bridge while people are using that temporary road, and you construct the new one, but then you'll need to do a closure again. So what we're often trying to do is to minimize that disruption point down as low as possible. But given our income raising agenda, I might try and sell tickets for a bridge demolition, I think.
Proceed. Can I now just ask a very trivial question, but it has come up to me on several sources. While the Copgate one-way system was under consultation or whatever it was, the bus that used to go through Coppergate was diverted round and up Piccadilly and to its normal bus stop in Laird or wherever it is, Pavement. Now that's permanent. I have had complaints that there is no intermediate bus stop between getting on the bus. If you get on the bus in Rougier Street, say, you cannot get off before you get to Pavement and Marks and Spencer's. Now, that wasn't too bad when you were just cutting through Coppergate, but now it actually is taking you quite a really long loop. And it has been suggested to me that there should be an interim bus stop, at least one interim bus stop along that way, either in Clifford Street or at the bottom or in Piccadilly, to enable people who aren't particularly necessarily wanting to go, because it is a long diversion and it was all right while it was temporary, but now it's permanent. Do you think there could be some discussion on that one?
Yeah, so we at the moment we are working on a review of the bus operation in the city centre, and certainly I can take that point away and add that into the mix to the consultants.
Thanks. Councillor Hook.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just concerned because as York Central is happening and everything else, I presume you want more people to go around the ring road, but if the ring road's being dualled at the same time, I hope it's not. That's basically my question, because I can just think, how on earth do you get anywhere?
I can't give you date, and part of the challenge with this is we can't give you firm dates on the whole programme. So even for things that are much closer for station frontage and the demolition of that bridge, we're not actually in contract with the construction company to build that yet. They need to come in and do their review and work out when they're going to do phases of work. So whilst we've got rough ideas, until we're actually in contract and we've got that sorted, we haven't, although we've submitted planning permission for Ring Road, we haven't actually yet got that approval. So they're probably further off from that than any of the three we've mentioned.
The other thing I'm worried about is that the A19 1237 roundabout is being held off until the dualling happens, but it won't last another week or so because it is getting so bad.
Are you referring to the surface of the?
Yeah, it is just really bad. You've got, because I got onto it in another leg today, and you have to approach it at 2 miles an hour, and you can't do that.
There's an application for a permit for resurfacing work on the A19 at the moment, which I think it's planned for May time, but that hasn't been approved yet.
Because that's the
'Cause
whole roundabout.
it is a
Every
very
approach is
disruptive
potholes that
piece of
big at
work,
least.
but it would be, we are trying to undertake that work in advance of the planned work on the ring road on the bridges in May, towards the end of May.
Right, and similarly,
Just to reassure you, we're not waiting for the dual.
good, that's
the
good,
point.
because it can't wait. And the other thing was the other roundabout, because we got an email that for that one and the Woodthorpe Askham Bryan roundabout too, because as you approach from, say, Clifton Moor, that roundabout, that is just full of potholes as well. It's absolutely disgusting.
No, I'd need to check that one.
That approach
that's
on the
more of
Woodthorpe
a-
one.
That's more of a road maintenance issue. I don't know whether we've got a
Yeah,
programme for that.
but it was in the same email, but that was going to be done the same time as the,
So there are,
not
well,
mentioning it now.
without getting into highway maintenance too much, I'm aware this isn't a highway maintenance, but it kind of picks up the comment about that was made earlier as well. So with highway maintenance, the important thing to remember is there's two sorts of highway maintenance. There is reactive, which is where the highway inspectors have an ongoing programme of inspecting the highway, and they will recommend emergency pothole repairs, and that happens in response to resident reports when they report it on the website, to you when you contact us through members' inquiries. They all feed into that sausage machine, and the inspector goes out and they have to make a judgment call about whether they think that pothole requires repair. And that's a judgment call they have to defend in court if they get it wrong. So it's a relatively serious undertaking. And that, to a certain extent, that is how we make sure the highway is safe, is that pothole repair one. Separately to that, and this is more of an asset management point, we have a proactive maintenance programme where we go out and do resurfacing. And that is because we think the best way to keep that surface safe is to do a full resurfacing rather than just a pothole repair. So we do both of those. So if you've got concerns about any bit of highway, do that. And to come back to the point that was made earlier, the high amp that executive approved in 2021, I think, the highway asset management plan does prioritise cycle margins in terms of being a higher priority for making sure that surface is smooth.
Thank you. Councillor Gone.
Yeah, just wanted to follow up the point about York Central and the disruption there. And I mean, particularly thinking about one of the points was made about trying to promote sustainable travel. I believe in a few weeks' time, the Poppleton Park and Ride will be restarting. So I think, you know, that would be a very good point to make in conjunction with whatever disruption is happening on Water End, to be able to say that, you know, we are aware there's going to be increased congestion, but for our bus priority lanes along A59, they might not go all the way, but certainly would help if people were using that park and ride and reducing the traffic levels on that corridor. So sort of make that point.
Thank you. So I'll ask a few questions for me, and then I'll come to you, Councillor Pearson. So, and I might just be misreading the document. I believe Lendal Bridge is set for works. Is that's not on the list, is it, in this report? Forgive me if I've just missed it.
So I can't remember whether it's in the report or not off the top of my head. The phone's too small to read it. But at some point we will need to do some waterproofing works on Lendal Bridge, but we haven't got that programmed in yet.
And that would be classed as a major project. Number of weeks.
It would have to be, you know, re-waterproofing a bridge deck is quite a significant piece of work. So it would be disruptive when it was undertaken, and we are looking at programming of it when that comes forward.
And that's likely to come forward during some of what's on that list at a similar time.
The timing is still to be determined on that. There's further survey work to be undertaken to look at the structure But as we said, these schemes that we're running through do proceed for several years, and we will look for the best possible time to undertake that work to minimise the disruption.
I mean, that's a good example of a scheme that's within our gift to a certain extent. So
Yeah.
provided that survey work doesn't highlight a particular emergency element to that, as the local authority, we have a certain element of flexibility to go. There's a window of opportunity because
Yeah.
York Central, I'm not sure I should say this, York Central is quiet for a month. Now's the time to schedule it in. Might be an opportunity. On the other hand, we might be going, do you know what? Actually, if it can last another year, it can last another year and we'll do it then. So it's that sort of flexibility that we need to show, particularly with our own projects, but we also encourage other promoters of works to take.
Thank you. Cheers. I wanted to ask about buses. So obviously, I think it's in one of the principles around making best efforts to still support sustainable travel while works are taking place. The Water End westbound closure will be significant. Now, would I be right in thinking that will impact on the number 10 service? And I'm wondering how. I mean, yes, it's in my ward, but it's a significant size community. What will happen with that bus service during that time? Do we know yet?
We haven't got the exact details of that, but it's an item that we need to look at. Isolating communities is something that we don't want to take forward. Generally speaking, bus routes are diverted to the closest location they can be, so that the distance to bus stops is as close as possible to the residents. That particular community is a difficult location to do that, and we are looking at a supplementary bus service, shuttle bus service, potentially to the city centre, which would have to be paid by the promoter of the scheme.
Which would be the York Central Partnership? Or...
Yes, we've got the York Central. Well, the developer, in terms of the section 278 agreement, section 38 agreement we have with them for delivering the highway works, is Homes England are the developer.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, that is a worry, but I appreciate it's on your radar.
Yeah, it is.
And more broadly, and this isn't necessarily exclusive to these, but I do occasionally come across roadworks in the ward or around the city that bus services, well, councillors aren't always told about, but bus services aren't aware of. And I'm guessing, would those cases be in situations where it's been a very unexpected short notice piece of work that's required?
If there is a temporary order, so if there's a closure or a lane closure, we always notify the bus operators. But there are situations where the utilities have a right to attend to an emergency, and then they have to notify us post intervention, because obviously if there's a gas leak, they need to be there, and they have to notify us within 2 hours. And then obviously we have to notify the bus operator. So that can take some time to get through to a change of service, obviously.
Okay.
And I think just in terms of what we do encourage all councillors to do, and we're encouraging residents increasingly to do, is to sign up to that alerts piece that Tony mentioned on the website. So on our website, you can access the One Network information, and you can literally sign up for an alert and go, if there's roadworks in my ward, I want to know. So you can sign up.
Yesterday.
It's a useful tool.
It's quite impressive, actually. I had far too many notifications this morning. But yeah, definitely something to promote, which brings me to another question around comms. I mean, that's a handy tool for those who are fairly savvy online. But obviously not everyone is. I accept that you say the promoter of the scheme should be communicating about closures and impacts properly. I would say they don't always do that, and sometimes certain organisations are prone to shortcuts. and it's just a coincidence that it's in my ward. York Central happens to be there, but it's a citywide concern. But the residents living there, I'm not sure I don't think have they received comms to let them know in hard copy that Water End will be shut one way, amongst other things going on? Maybe it's
No,
too early for that.
It is a little bit early for that. They won't have received anything about that. That they should be receiving items about when there's overnight closures, which are coming up shortly. So they should receive letters from the York Central Partners, from the contractor who was undertaking work, notifying them there is that activity.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's hope they deliver enough letters, because that's been an issue over the years. James?
No, I was going to say, and whilst Tony's absolutely right, the onus is on the promoter or the developer to do that communications piece. As Tony also alluded, we had a media briefing last week, I think, which was basically to start to talk to the press about how we change the relationship we have with the press. So rather than responding, I don't mean the press as an individual, I mean the press and the media in general, so that we change that narrative from them reporting there were traffic problems yesterday to actually would they become a really useful part of the community and say there's going to be traffic challenges tomorrow in this location. You need to be aware, residents, so that you leave 10 minutes earlier, use a different mode. So we're trying to create with the media that different relationship so that we can be more proactive and transparent with them about what's coming, so that they can be part of that communication tool. Because I'm acutely aware not everyone is going to sign up for an alert to get a message in the morning to say it's going to take longer. So trying to use as many different methods and tools. And we're also looking at a new section of the website about how our major projects are running in the city and how they might impact. So we're refreshing and rethinking that.
Yeah.
Leeds have got quite a good model, and whilst I think we're going to have problems, I think it will pale into insignificance in terms of some of the development that Leeds is managing. But actually what we're going to do is steal the sort of the model and the way they're communicating that to residents on the website as well.
Okay, that's interesting. And I appreciate efforts being made to sort of rise to the challenge. I do think it's massive. I'm sure we all do. I mean, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but I think whenever there is anything mentioned about a road closure, temporary or otherwise, if you look at the social media comments, Councillor de Gorn is often blamed by people who aren't close to the detail. And I think in a lot of cases, it's not fair. And not to say we should do this for you, we should do it for the whole city. But there's a real need to have that properly proactive comms on and offline. I mean, even the council have its regular brochure. What do they call it? Our City. A standing item in that I think would be good. And you know, we see if the York Press would entertain a regular advert at a discount price. But it's something we've got to get a hold of, because this is a years-long story, isn't it? You might already appreciate this. I don't want to come across as patronising you, but I'm only saying it to communicate to the millions watching that we get it. We've really got to. We can't have any hard measures.
Can I chip in as well, Chair, and say it's not just your residents which needs to receive a letter.
Of course,
it's the taxi companies as well as the bus companies, people who would be using those roads even after midnight on a regular basis.
The way that is done is usually with advanced signage on the roads where the closures, so because that's the most effective way for people who use that road regularly. So obviously we can't write to everybody because actually we don't know who uses the road, but if we put advanced signage, that's usually how we do it, the yellow sign saying works planned. So obviously we can write to the residents. The other point I wanted to make is, so One Network is the website that we use, but that's picked up by all the major navigation tools. So Google, picks up the data from one network. And also there's assistance available for councillors. So I think Councillor Hook, you were saying you might have had difficulty signing up. For councillors, the Streetworks team can help you to get a login and everything. So just email them if that's okay. Streetworks, so streetworks@york.gov.uk.
James, and then I'll bring in Councillor Pearson. Thanks.
And I think just to join the two bits together, part of the reason why the notification and the time for works is important is it allows us to get this bit right. So actually the time saying we need, 10 days notice or 3 months notice is to make sure we can get this communications bit right. That's why the legislation's written the way it is, and partly why we're very keen to adopt that permit scheme.
Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. A couple of minor questions, really. On page 101, they've got the section 278 works. I just wanted to ask the Nestle South Wigginton Road scheme what that is. Is that to do with the Cocoa Works housing site? And the second question, this is one of my last council meetings, so I'll say it. Just bring up Haxby Station and just say, are there any associated roadworks that would be going into the major projects works as part of the Haxby Station scheme? For example, traffic lights or a new roundabout at the Towthorpe Road, Towthorpe Moor Lane, Strensall Road interchange, that awkward dog leg junction.
Well, I'll do that. The Haxby Station, obviously, once that's run through the planning process to determine exactly what the layout would be, there will be a need to a junction on Towthorpe Road there. That will involve works which will be disruptive during that period. Whether they consider to be sort of major works which would impact on other areas around the city, so the sort of coordination might be a bit simpler at that location, but that will run through the same process in terms of notification and streetworks permits.
Wigginton Road, Nestle, so that's the Cocoa West development, and that's because they have to remodel their junction, so there will be an outbound right turn lane that will be created there, an island for pedestrians to cross to go to the bus stops, which will be themselves relocated, and also the plan is to have the cycle route continuing across their junction with a priority for cyclists. So they have to remodel all of that, which obviously will require some closure or lane closure at least.
I have one more question, which I'll ask, so I've got no hands at the minute. So again, coming back to York Central, there's some like dependencies, so certain things can't happen until other things have been done. For example, the Railway Museum's expansion. So Lehman Road, as we know it, cannot close until that new road, Spine Road, whatever we're calling it, the new Lehman Road is ready and usable. I'm conscious that the museum have their target for 2025, and I know I've asked you this in an informal meeting, but just for public record, if there's a danger of the sequence of works meaning that the museum might not be able to open their new building on the year of their 50th anniversary, am I right in thinking that that holds zero weight in terms of the job that officers have to do?
From a highway regulatory point of view, which is where we're in here, it doesn't matter. So in the same way we can delay waterworks if they're not emergency works, because it doesn't work from a coordination point of view, we will do the same with other works where we potentially, from a strategic partnership point of view, have an interest in those happening. So there are different functions of the council doing that, and we've got some protocols in place to separate out the functions of the council so that we don't wear two hats in that, so that actually us three here sit with that regulatory function and not a partnership function. That's a different set of officers, so we don't blur those boundaries.
So there's no danger of shortcuts then in order to try and meet a birthday.
Well, I think they will look at their programme and obviously try and reach that, and we will be
Yeah.
reasonable in trying to make that happen, but we won't allow shortcuts that mean there are safety impacts or those sorts of things. What we're also acutely aware of is there's a balance to be struck between minimising the pain, but prolonging it for 3, 4, 5 years. I'm not talking about York Central, I'm just talking generally. There's a balance to be struck between minimising the pain, but there is some pain and it's for a very long period of time, against actually is a shorter period of pain better for that. So there's always a balance to be struck in this. There isn't a sort of a perfect answer in that, I don't think. Sonny?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that there is close integration between the Network Rail team, the NRM team, I should say, in for the development works for the museum, and the York Central infrastructure team to try and integrate any disruption on Lehman Road as much as possible, as you know, so it's limited as much as possible in that area.
Yeah. I mean, I only asked the question, it's genuinely not to be awkward, it's because due to all sorts of reasons, I think York Central slipped a little bit anyway, and this is a very dense set of works coming up in the next year or two. So I think it's a possibility that that tension might arise between them and the wider sort of highway requirements. But thanks for your answers.
The other thing I should just say on that is, in terms of not having any closure on Lehman Road, there is obviously overnight closures for movement of plant and things. So there may be specific locations or times when a closure may be needed, but we are keeping those to an absolute minimum until the new infrastructure is in place.
Yeah, and that's different, isn't it, to having that permanent replacement road in before they can really get down to business with their site. But yeah, I do appreciate that. Any other questions? I mean, one recommendation I would like to raise, hopefully not an awkward one, is that due to just how much is going on, I think this committee would be a good place to keep updated on it as a specific item. I mean, it'd be down to them, but I'd recommend quarterly, depending on what the corporate calendar looks like. Any views? I mean, I think this has been genuinely helpful, and you know, if all the things around comms end up coming to fruition, we'll be getting to a better place. Councillor Pearson.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Just whether quarterly is the right amount, I don't know, but regular updates on, because I think we have such an intensive capital programme coming up. It's going to be a contentious issue for a number of years, I think.
Yeah, if nothing else, it's really good to have it all gathered together, all the things that are going on, so you can see it. So even if it wasn't necessarily a talk through update, just have a notice coming out to say at the moment this is all what's happening and it's going to happen, and it gets updated and we get it often, or somewhere to go to get it.
I think if you put it in the timetable, then it's something you can always say, actually, there isn't anything to report this time round, so you just park it. But if you put it in the timetable, it keeps a check on it and it keeps it on the record. So I think it's well worth doing it.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Locker. So, recommendation to, well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, to consider it as part of the future work plan, ideally at least twice a year, but leave it for them to. Well, we don't have many meetings and there's too many things to squeeze in.
I would leave it for the next committee to make a decision on the frequency, but
I don't know whether it helps, but if you go back to all major roadworks need 3 months notice, meeting every 3 months may almost be too quick. So you don't have to go 3 or 6, you can go something in between potentially. I'm just thinking that you could, if you're not careful, you'll be coming and we'll be going, well, we haven't had another 3 month notice come in.
We'll have questions for you. Nah, the point taken. Absolutely. But yeah, well, the next committee will, whoever's here after early May. But I think that brings us to the end of that item, and thank you all for your time this evening. We haven't got onto the work plan. That's on the agenda, isn't it? Yeah. Indeed, yeah. So that, just to very briefly come to the final item. Thank you, colleagues. I know it's been a longish one. We've got the work plan. Got paper and online here in front of me. I mean, this will be for the next committee, post-election. I'm sure they'll have their own items, but obviously we've tonight requested that we get a regular update, or they consider having a regular update on this bunch of major projects taking place, and a regular update on the city centre cafe licenses issue and how they're progressing under the new scheme. I'm guessing at this stage in the municipal term, because we might not be on this committee after May, there's no new thoughts to add. You've been a fantastic substitute, Councillor Looker. But I'll save my soppy thank yous for the commission slot in a couple of weeks, on the 21st. But yeah, with that in mind, I'll bring the meeting to a close. There's no urgent business, so let's have a good night.